America regulates everything, and yet, in the coal country of eastern Pennsylvania, there is a town the government officially condemned, seized through eminent domain, and erased from the postal map. It has no zip code. Almost every building is gone. The state owns nearly all the land, and a handful of people still live there, legally. So why couldn't America finish emptying a town it had already decided to erase? Because Centralia isn't a story about a government losing control. It's a story about a fire, a piece of ground nobody could use, and a question that has shaped decisions for as long as governments have existed. What do you do with a place that costs more to fix than it seems worth? At first glance, Centralia barely looks like a town at all. There is a street grid with almost no buildings on it. Old sidewalks lead to empty lots. A well-kept cemetery sits on a hillside above the silence. And in a few places, if the air is cold enough, you can see smoke rising straight out of the ground. Just south of town, there used to be a stretch of old Route 61, so buckled and cracked by heat that people covered it in graffiti and called it the Graffiti Highway. In 2020, it was buried under dirt to keep the crowds away. Because underneath all of this, a fire is still burning. Centralia sits on top of the Mammoth Coal Seam, one of the richest anthracite deposits in the country. In the late 1800s, that coal made it a real town. At its peak, around 2,700 people lived here, with churches, schools, shops, and a busy main street. Then, in 1962, the fire started. The most widely accepted account is almost unbelievably ordinary. To clean up the local landfill before Memorial Day, crews burned trash in an old strip mine pit at the edge of town. The fire reached an exposed vein of coal, and the coal caught. Coal doesn't burn like a bonfire. It smolders slowly, deep underground, following the seams. The fire spread into the labyrinth of abandoned mine tunnels beneath the town, and no one could reach it. Crews tried digging it out, flushing it, drilling it, cutting trenches to stop it. Nothing worked. The fire simply kept moving through the coal, hundreds of feet down, across a footprint that eventually spanned thousands of acres. For years, most residents lived above it anyway. The danger was invisible. The ground was warm in winter. It was easy to believe the problem would be solved. Then, in 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was standing in a backyard when the ground opened beneath him. A sinkhole, venting hot steam and toxic gas, swallowed him up to a tree root he grabbed and held until his cousin pulled him out. The fire was no longer invisible. It was deadly, and it was under people's homes. That changed everything. And here is where the government finally moved. In 1984, Congress set aside roughly $42 million to relocate the residents of Centralia. Most people took the buyout and left. In 1992, Pennsylvania condemned all the remaining properties through eminent domain, claiming the land for the state. In 2002, the Postal Service revoked the town's zip code. Officially, Centralia was being wound down and wiped off the map. By 1990, the population had fallen to around 60. By 2000, about 20. The 2020 census counted 5. So on paper, this looks like a case where the government did use its full authority. It spent the money, won the court fights, and cleared the town. Which makes the real question sharper, not softer. Because if the state condemned everything, why are people still living there? And why, after more than 60 years, is the fire still burning? Because authority and incentives are not the same thing. Start with the fire. Putting it out was always possible in theory, but estimates to actually extinguish it ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, with no guarantee of success, to save a small town on a coal seam that could burn for another 250 years. The officials did the math and reached a brutal conclusion. It was cheaper to move the people than to save the town. So they didn't fight the fire, they relocated the community and let the coal burn. That single decision tells you how the rest of the story would go. Once the state chose the cheaper path, the land itself became worthless. You cannot build on ground that is on fire. You cannot sell it, farm it, or develop it. There is no tax revenue to chase, no growing population demanding services, no developer eyeing the lots. Every reason a government normally has to reclaim and control a piece of land had been burned away. Now think about the last holdouts. A small group of residents refused to leave. They loved the town, or they simply didn't believe the buyouts were fair, and the state faced a familiar calculation. It had already spent its $42 million and won in court. What exactly would it gain by forcibly dragging a handful of elderly people out of their homes in front of the cameras off land that no one else wanted anyway? Almost nothing. And it would cost plenty in bad press and political grief. So in 2013, the two sides reached a settlement. The remaining residents could stay for the rest of their lives. When the last of them dies, their property reverts to the state. The government didn't win by finishing the eviction. It won by agreeing to wait. This is the same pattern that lets remote settlements survive on the edges of the map, turned inside out. In most of those places, distance is what keeps the pressure away. Hundreds of miles between people and the institutions that govern them. Centralia has almost no distance at all. It sits a short drive from other towns, in one of the oldest settled parts of the country. But the fire created its own kind of distance. It made the ground unusable, the property unsellable, and the whole place something no one had a strong reason to fight over. The state held every legal card and still had almost no incentive to play the last one. And that raises the final question. If Centralia is already nearly empty, what happens next? Here, the incentives point in only one direction, and it is a countdown. The fire will very likely outlast every person now living above it, possibly by centuries. The residents will not. When the last holdout is gone, the population reaches zero, the final properties return to the Commonwealth, and the town that was condemned in 1992 finishes disappearing on its own. Notice how the ending actually arrives. Not with the state finally forcing everyone out, but with the incentive to simply wait quietly, outlasting everything else. The government never needed to win the last fight. It only needed the fire to make waiting the easiest option. And the fire did exactly that. And that brings us back to where we started. America has a reputation for rules, for agencies, for a government with the reach to remove almost anyone from almost anywhere. The story of Centralia is not a story about that power failing. Pennsylvania condemned the town, seized the land, and erased its place on the map. The authority was never in doubt. The story is about incentives. A cheap trash fire hit a rich coal seam. Putting it out cost more than moving the town. The scorched land lost every ounce of its value, and removing the last few people who stayed cost more than leaving them be. Step after step, the expensive option was control, and the cheap option was to let it go. What makes Centralia unforgettable isn't that people defied the system, it's that the system, holding all the power in the world, kept deciding it had better things to spend that power on. And that lesson reaches far beyond one burning town in Pennsylvania, because the same forces that empty a place can also be the reason a government leaves it standing. Not authority, incentives. America never lost the power to erase Centralia. The fire just made it easier to wait. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.